Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope that you're all doing well. Last year I made this skirt and the plan was always to make a jacket to go with it. So that's what I did over this summer. I also made the waistcoat, but you saw that video already. So in this video we're going to detail the process of making the jacket. I used Patterns of Time AG 1175 1896 coat of striped brocade, and I am quite pleased with this pattern. Patterns from Patterns of Time never fit very well without doing something to them first. You always have to make several mock-ups to get them to fit correctly because they don't scale them or size them in any way. They're just taken from the original pattern books. So there was a large mock-up process. I didn't film any of that, but I'm very happy with how the pattern turned out. After having made the mock-up, which process I did not film because it was highly frustrating for me and I knew that filming it would just make it even worse, I traced it onto the lining fabric. And what I always do when I'm tracing out my patterns is I trace around the actual pattern and just cut outside of the line a little bit to leave room for the seam allowance. So my tracing lines are where I'm going to sew, so I don't need to measure very exactly for my seam allowance, and I don't need to make sure that I'm sewing exactly correctly on the machine. I can just follow the lines. So that's what I'm doing here. I made the lining of this jacket out of the leftover fabric that I used to line the skirt that goes with this jacket, and it's just a cheap but crisp and strong cotton. Now the color, this is a color that you see a lot in linings of the 19th century. Normally in the 19th century, things are lined in polished cotton, so that's a cotton textile that's had some processes done to it to make it shiny. That's difficult to come by these days. It is still made, but it's not made very frequently, and it's hard to get your hands on, and when you can get your hands on it, it is usually sort of expensive. But it was usually in this color, so even though this is not the correct kind of polished cotton, it is still the correct color. And I mean, you do see linings in the 19th century that aren't polished cotton, so this isn't inaccurate. It's just not got that je ne sais quoi that it could otherwise have. But that's okay, because this is going to be entirely hidden at the end, because I'm going to put in another lining over it. Extra bounty points if you can tell me the name of the audiobook I'm listening to in this clip.
Dr. John Montague was a doctor of philosophy. He had taken his degree in anthropology, feeling obscurely that in this field he might come closest to his true vocation, the analysis of supernatural manifestations. He was scrupulous about the use of his title because his investigations being so utterly unscientific, he hoped to borrow an air of respectability, even scholarly authority from his education.
All right, I just left this recording for an hour. Took me a long time to get those seams sewn up, but now the lining seams are sewn up. But to get that lining, those princess seams to fit me correctly, it's gonna need some fish, so I'm gonna go put those in. All right, let's take a break while I explain what I was talking about in that last clip. Fish are horizontal darts sewn into the linings of Victorian clothing. Not only Victorian. Horizontal darts sewn into the linings of clothing. They make the fabric lie more smoothly over the curves of the body. What you do is you make the lining, sew it all together, and then put it on, and you see where the fabric wants to kind of bunch up, and then you take a pleat there, a horizontal pleat, or sometimes a diagonal pleat, just to get it all to lie flat. Then you sew those pleats into place, then you put the fashion fabric over top of what you've just done. And magically, somehow, I don't understand how, but magically, the fashion fabric will kind of mold itself. It'll take on the shape of the lining with the pleats in it, so the fashion fabric won't wrinkle and pucker. I don't know how it works, but it does. So that's what I'm about to go do. I'm about to go pin in those fish darts to make sure that it lies nicely over the curve of my waist. After I'd gotten all of the fish sewn into the lining, I cut out the jacket from the actual fashion fabric, and as a template for this, I just used the same mock-up pieces that I used to cut out the lining fabric. Okay, the fish have been sewn in. This will make it fit very nicely. So now, there's also one up here. So now it's time to unpick this lining and put on the outer fabric. And I'm not gonna unpick this seam because the fish had to go right over the seam. So the outer fabric is just gonna be basted over this whole thing. But the two back pieces are going to be separated, and they're going to be separated from here too. And the outer fabric is going to be basted on top. I then began the laborious process of pinning the fashion fabric to the lining. At the back, this was relatively easy, but if you see here with this front piece, it's very, very curvy. The lining has a lot of texture and body to it because of these fish that I pinned in. It wants to lie in a very curved way, and the fashion fabric doesn't have these fish in there, so it was a really, really big challenge to be able to pin it out so that the fashion fabric laid flat while the lining was able to still keep its curve. But I did manage it eventually. As laborious as pinning the two pieces together was, basting them together was significantly worse. And I'm sorry if you hear any bird noises. He's been going berserker on his little bell, so he might start challenging it to a duel. Basting these two pieces together was incredibly time consuming. It wasn't exactly hard, there wasn't any real challenge to it. It was just time consuming, it was tedious, it was uncomfortable because I had to be sitting on the floor, and I started to get really stiff after a while, and it took me days of just sewing all day. It was awful. I do not want to repeat that process ever again, and it's really sad because I know I will repeat that process many times more in my life in future sewing projects. But that just makes the end result that much the sweeter, doesn't it? This transition was about a minute for you, it was about a week for me, but eventually I did get all of the basting done, which meant I could get on with actually sewing all of the pieces together, which was so much fun. Oh, it was lovely to get to that point. Having gotten the jacket sewn together, it was then time to work on the revers, or potentially revers. I'm pretty sure it's revers. Basically the lapel. It's the pointy things that fold back, and the lapel, it's the lapel. So I made a mock-up out of the leftovers of the plaid fabric that I used to make the dress that I'm wearing right here in this shot. Haha, funny little inception. And then I am cutting it out of horsehair canvas, tailor's canvas. After cutting out these pieces, I pad stitched them. I'm not going to have a very in-depth explanation of pad stitching because I've done pad stitching in several of my other videos beforehand. I'll link them down below, the 1890s waiter's jacket and the 1890s waistcoat. I did pad stitching in those. But basically what you do is you kind of do a zigzag, by hand you do kind of zigzag stitch over the thing that you want to shape, and where you want it to curve or fold, you wrap it around your finger and then stitch it around like that, and that will hold it into this turn back shape. So that's how I got the collar to get its flip back, and that's how I got the lapels to come out this way. Otherwise they would just kind of stick out like that. So that's what pad stitching is done for. Again, I will link below to other videos in which I talk about it more in depth. After doing all of that excruciating pad stitching, I sewed the pad stitched part onto the black velvet, which is going to be the part that's actually showing on top. I then repeated the same process for the collar, and I decided not to speed up this clip so you can see how long it actually takes me to sew things. It's a while. I don't sew quickly. Now I, in my infinite stupidity, forgot to cut out the velvet part of the collar before doing all of the pad stitching, so I had to cut it out after I'd already done the pad stitching, which did make it slightly more difficult because the pad stitching, the whole point of the pad stitching is to put a shape into the fabric. So it was a little bit difficult to use it as a pattern piece, but we got there in the end, and it didn't scupper the process. Also, I'm sorry if you're hearing bird noises. There's nothing I can really do about that. After I'd finished assembling the collar, I sewed it on to the jacket. Not a very complicated process. Here we are so far. I've gotten the revers pinned in. I think this one needs to go down ever so slightly, so it's even with this one. And I've got the collar sewn in too. And if I want to be theatrical, oh, very theatrical. I think it makes me look a little bit like an insect, but that's all right. I've always had a certain fondness for insects, so I'm fine to look like one, ever so slightly. So I'm going to move this one down ever so slightly, and then I'm going to cut out the facings that will go, and they're the things that will hold these into place. Here's the process of pinning in that front facing. It operates just how any other front facing does. It hides the rawness of those front edges. And it also works to hold in the revers. The same stitches that are holding this on are also sewing the revers onto the jacket. So it's an all-around upstanding piece of fabric. And because it would never do to just have part of my clothing pinned into place, after all, this is the 19th century, not the 18th century, I sewed that front facing into place, and I think that was a very good decision on my part. I then began to stitch on the decoration. I embellished the edges of this jacket with a black wool hat braid from Burnley and Trowbridge Company, not the same kind that I usually use to edge my skirts, but the thinner, narrower one. I'll put a picture of it up on screen. And I decided to sew that on by hand to make it look more dainty, and because of a decision that I made later on, the stitching was never seen. So I could have just sewn this on by machine and saved myself a lot of headache and a lot of time. But hindsight is 2020, so I'm not going to blame myself for what I didn't know at the time, even though my fingers do really resent me for putting them through that. After I got the bottom part of that braid sewn on, I flicked water on it and ironed it all down so it was nice and flat, and then sewed the top part of it down. You can see how it's sewn on a curve and it wants to bubble up, so ironing it and steaming it into shape took away that desire for it to bubble up. I didn't feel myself sewing on the top part of it because it was just the exact same as sewing on the bottom. After I'd gotten the braid sewn on, I went in with this soutache trim, and I tried to sew this on by hand, but it did not look very good at all. It was all wrinkly. It looked so much better sewn on by machine, so I did it by machine. And the original plan was to actually have this about half an inch above the braid, but that also just looked awful. I had it pinned into place and it just looked really, really bad, and I can't quite put my finger on why, but it didn't look good. So instead I decided to use it as an edging for the braid and to cover up all of that very meticulously done hand stitching. Oh well. This jacket doesn't close by meeting or overlapping at the front. There's actually a gap of several inches at the front, and that gap is spanned by straps that go across and close with hooks and eyes. So here I'm cutting out the lining for those straps, and I'm cutting them out of canvas because I wanted something sturdier, and then of course I covered that canvas with the same green wool that I used for the rest of the jacket. I'm working on the sleeves right now, and the sleeves have an inner sleeve, which is smaller, and then they've got the larger mutton leg sleeve on the outside. And I have kind of hemmed and hawed about whether or not to, what to do with this, but I'm thinking I actually won't use the inner sleeve lining, the more fitted sleeve lining, for several reasons. First of all, because I think I'm going to want to wear sleeve bustles with this dress, and of course I won't be able to do those with it, or I guess I could, but I'd have to sew them in first, and then I wouldn't be able to access them for maintenance purposes. But also I'm going to have the outer sleeve, which is going to be wool, and then of course I need to flatline it because you just kind of have to. So that's 2 layers, and then I'm going to wear a shirt underneath it. So that's already 3 layers. So having the lining in there would make it 4 layers thick, which seems a bit much. It seems like that would make it a little bit difficult to move my arms, so anything I can do to decrease the layering on my arms, I think I will. So that's my plan for now, is just to not do the inner sleeve, the fitted sleeve lining, and I might change my mind later. I might decide that it is necessary and put it in. It's something that I can put in pretty easily at any point in time. But for now, I'm going to just have the outer sleeve. So here I'm cutting out the sleeve from the lining and from the green wool. And for the lining, I didn't have enough of that brown fabric left, so I just used this piece of white fabric from my stash. I think it was actually a bed sheet originally, but it did the job perfectly well. And then the green fabric was not quite wide enough, so I had to piece it. I had to do the tiniest little bit of piecing. And you can't tell, and of course everybody knows that piecing is period, so it's not that big of a deal. Really, it was just kind of irritating because it was tedious. However, you ought to be glad about the piecing, because in sewing together the piecing, I created the de rigueur sewing machine ASMR. I hope you'll enjoy. When doing 1890 sleeves, I always sew on the bottom ungathered part before even doing the gathering for the top part. I just find that makes it so much easier. Only then does it come time to gather down the sleeve head. And of course to subsequently sew it into the arm side. This sleeve is partially shaped by a large inverted box pleat taken right above the elbow, so here you'll see I'm tacking that into place. Then came the incredibly satisfying process of removing the pad stitching. As painful as it was to put that in there, you'd think that it would be very saddening to take it out, but it's not. It's incredibly fun and incredibly satisfying to take that temporary stitching out. And yes, it did require some tooth action, which is not the most dignified way of ripping out stitches, but it does make it even that much more satisfying. It's time to do the lining, and I'm filming like this because my filming stand has broken, so you can't see my face right now. Sorry about that. So I've got this. This cost me $1 at an estate sale, and I've done a burn test on it, and it smelled like a belch from every orifice of Satan. It smelled so incredibly awful, and I did it in an enclosed room with all of the windows shut, which is very clever of me. I think it's a silk cotton blend. It definitely had that burning hair smell, but some of it behaved more like cotton. It is a little bit slubby, as you can tell, and I think the slubs are the cottony bits. Now, slubby fabrics were not fashionable in the late 19th century, or really for any time in history up until I think the 1940s or 50s, maybe the 30s. I don't know, it has a 30s-ish type of feel. So it would not be a fashionable choice, and generally it would not be accurate to make an overdress out of a slubby silk like a dupioni or a shantung. However, just because slubby fabrics were not fashionable does not mean that they did not exist. There were cheaply made or badly made silks in the past, and they oftentimes would have had slubs, and they would have been sold at highly reduced rates. And it is very likely that a young woman who is short of money, potentially because she's going to law school and is in extreme debt, would choose to use one of these cheaply made, inexpensive, slubby silks to line her new jacket. So for a lining, for a person like me with not very much money, this is actually probably the most accurate choice I could have gone with. So I'm going to cut this out. Also, I somehow do not have the mock-up panels that I made for this jacket, so I don't actually know what shapes the lining needs to be, like how I need to modify the pattern to make the lining actually fit to it correctly. So what I'm going to have to do is either cut this out with the pattern and then fit it again onto myself, or somehow try to pull a pattern from the jacket and use that to cut this out. I'm not sure which one I'm going to do yet. Pulling the pattern from the jacket seems harder, quite frankly. I mean, I've already been able to use this pattern and fit it to myself, so I think that is going to be what I'm going to do. If I've done it once, I can do it again. I am very irritated about having to do it again, but I've got no one to blame but myself. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I did not film the process of putting in the lining because it was highly irritating, and I was seriously considering just not lining this, which would have been very bad and very naughty of me, but I did eventually get it done, and I'm glad that I stuck with it. So we're going to go into the vanity footage now. I'll begin by putting my watch into a specially made watch pocket. This watch is hung on a chain woven from the hair of a dead woman. sorry, background music wasn't long enough to make a sound for this part, so I'm just talking. Hi. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, turn on the bell notification, and share, and I think that's everything. A huge thank you to Mary Royal, Kit Kat Stitch, Emily Donnelly, Sandra White, and V Birchwood for sponsoring this channel on Patreon. If you would also like to sponsor this channel on Patreon, I'll leave a link down below. If not, no hard feelings, I completely understand. I'm also going to leave a link to my Instagram where you should follow me, and unlike Patreon, following me on Instagram is completely free, so there's no excuse for not doing that. And I hope to see you around here next time. Bye-bye.